What's good YouTube, and Steel here, and the Ursiiday 21 this past weekend marks the last big event before the release of Shining Revelry and Ranked into Pokemon Pocket. However, almost 1,200 players gathered to leave their mark on the Triumphant Light meta in a tournament headlined by the dominance of Dialga, a Cinderella run by Gyarados, and even yours truly managed to get top 32 with Exeggutor. If you enjoy deep dives into the competitive meta or all things Pokemon Pocket, please consider liking and subscribing, and above all else, stay pro. If you've been keeping up with the meta since the very beginning of Triumphant Light, the top two decks continue the same, and if you've been following it week to week, you can tell that this week isn't too far different from like what we saw last week, as the top three decks still make up 40% of like the entire pool of cards being played. And even with the slight decrease of total percentage, Dialga Arceus is still making up like a quarter of the decks being played. Rampardos is now closer to 10%, and Gallade's the one that bumped up to 7.5. But in the grand scheme, it's pretty negligible. As I mentioned, overall, they still make up 40%. The bigger rise in popularity comes in the form of Darkrai and Weavile EX. Although significant, as they had 3 times the amount of representation as they had the week prior, it was highly anticipated, as Darkrai with Weavile is what won the tournament last week. So it's only natural to see more players either jump on the deck, whether it's a bandwagon reason, or see why the deck is so good in the current metagame. Another shift that might be due to the performances of last week is the Articuno 18 trainer, as it rose to own 5% of the entire player base on its own, while 18 trainer Palkia fell to under 2% of the player base. For reference, since I don't have it anywhere pictured, last week they shared an equal number of representation. In my personal opinion, what jumped out at me in a format that's pretty much been solved since the beginning of the set's release is the amount of non-Dialga Arceus decks that we found not only in the tournament but being successful, as the amount of decks that consisted of Arceus and not Dialga made up 12.5% of the player base, thus making it even more popular than Rampardos was in this specific tournament. And as exciting as it is to look at different innovations and strategies that were used as a whole, you get a better visual of exactly how the metagame has developed or is performing when you look into the top cut, which leads us to top 64 that clearly shows the dominance that Dialga, Arceus, and Rampardos have over the meta, as the majority of the innovations and strategies have been weeded out, and both Dialga and Rampardos have seen an increase of over 50%, as Dialga Arceus represents 37.5% of top cut and Rampardos represents 17.2%. This jump is a result of a long tournament like this where you have 10 rounds of Swiss, where luck and surprise factor can only take you so far, as something consistent and powerful will yield way better results in the long run. However, this also shows the resilience and strength of the third and fourth most popular decks, as Gallade and Darkrai were able to hold their ground in terms of how much of the metagame they represent. The most noticeable jump came in the form of Exeggutor EX with Arceus, as it only represented 2.7% of the 1,200 players that were playing. However, top 64 consisted of 4 players repping the deck, including yours truly. Although, full transparency, my run ended in top 32 against Arceus Dialga. However, I still stick to my meta call and believe it was a great choice for the event, and in a world where it had more representation, it could have done a lot better. Another deck that overperformed was 18 trainer Palkia, as despite having less than 2% of the 1,200 players, it had 3 decks representing it, which equaled the amount of 18 trainer Articunos that were also in top cut. The rest of top 64 has its array of random one-off decks and strategies, and top 32 essentially slashed all the numbers in half, keeping the statistical values about the same. It was going to top 16 that the tournament had a drastic turn. At the top 16, Dialga and Arceus have completely taken over, as 10 of the 16 decks left are just Dialga and Arceus. And the other 6 lists are all unique, as we have 1 Rampardos, 1 Darkrai Weavile, 1 Exeggutor with Arceus, 1 double Palkia, 1 18 trainer Palkia, and a Gyarados. And at this point, I'm almost convinced that Arceus is going to win the whole thing, as to this point they've been able to beat anything they put in the way, even if it's a bad matchup like Rampardos or Gallade. As you can see, there's only 1 Rampardos left. Even Exeggutor that kind of fights off, or the 18 trainer like Articunos and other Palkias that could get lucky with a few Misty flips and take it. No matter what was being thrown at them, the Dialga Arceus decks were thriving, and top 8 didn't get any better. In top 8, it came down to just 3 decks, as there was 6 Arceus Dialgas, 1 Gyarados, and 1 Rampardos. In a vacuum, Rampardos was in a great position to succeed, as there was a very high chance that for the rest of the tournament, all they had to face was Arceus. And on the other hand, we had a Cinderella story coming from Gyarados, as it came into the tournament being played by only just above 2% of the 1,200 players, so having 3 players representing it in top 64. And as we can see here, it's one of only 2 decks that made it to top 8 that aren't Dialga Arceus. And I have to say that the craziest thing, and the thing that blew my mind, was, would you believe me if I said, looking at a top 8 that consists of these decks, that the finals had no Dialga Arceus? But before I get to the decks that made it to the finals, I wanted to do a quick little shout out to the deck that I personally played in this tournament, as well as the deck that I believed was the best meta call, in the form of Exeggutor EX with Arceus. I truly believe that the late game power of Arceus along with the early game aggression of Exeggutor would be enough to not only take over the meta, but really take advantage of where it was going, as the win of Darkrai the week prior, alongside the rise of fighting decks in general, I truly set up myself for success. Although I might have underestimated not only how 50-50 the matchup was against the most popular deck in Dialga Arceus, but exactly how many people were gonna play it. Maybe I was too naive to believe it would see a little bit less play or a little less success due to the rise of the other decks in the format. But however, I don't regret my decision. As you can see down below, this is the amalgamation of all the games that anybody playing this deck in the tournament was against all the decks in the format. And then I individually wrote down how they did against the top decks in the format. As you can see, as a whole, the Exeggutor deck managed to win over half its games, regardless of the pilot. But when it came to going against the most popular deck, it was truly a 50-50, which is ultimately what knocked out the deck from the tournament, whether it was me or the other 3 players that made it to top 64. However, our hunch was pretty much on the money, as this deck crushed everything else in the meta. To go 75% win rate against the second best deck, almost 70 against the third best deck, and the deck that got the biggest prize because of this win last week. We completely dominated because of the type advantage. And full transparency, I was one of those losses. My only loss in Swiss came into a Darkrai matchup, but that's nor here nor there. I had piloted this list to an 8-1-1 record, winning my top 64 against Rampardos and eventually being eliminated by Dialga Arceus. And I won't go too into the card by card of this deck specifically because I have already made a video on it. And I will link it down below as well as put it in the title card above. So if you honestly haven't tried this deck out yet, I honestly recommend it. It's a lot of fun. It's very aggressive as well as very strong at the end game. And it's unfortunate that it didn't have the numbers to perform as well as other decks in the format. But I'm glad that I was able to at least give it a top 32. Now I want to go straight into the runner-up deck list, and when I say Cinderella story, this Gyarados really pulled what seems like a miracle statistically. As not only did the percentage of Gyarados players drop from one week to the other, as you can see from the key matchups down below, its total win rate against all decks in this format was just under 50%. And when you're looking into it against some of the better decks in the format, it basically got 50-50 with the best deck in the form of Dialga Arceus, but it did very poorly against Rampardos, going only 7 for 16, making it a 30% win rate. Only an 8% win rate. Only one Gallade lost to Gyarados in this tournament, and it did a 50-50 split with Darkrai as well. So against the top of the meta, it barely won out over Dialga. But this is a huge point that I wanted to put out, as it only takes one to beat the odds. Yes, maybe it has a bad matchup, maybe it's a little bit of luck, but when it comes to these tournaments, I think it's much more important to play what you feel comfortable with, because despite the numbers for Gyarados statistically being these, and anybody who looks at the format from like an outside perspective is going to look at Gyarados and think these are what represent it. When it's your day, you'll grab a list like the one to my right, and these numbers at the end of the day don't mean anything. This person was able to take it to not only second place, but the finals went to a game 3, which means it's entirely possible that this could have been the champion of the final tournament in the Triumphant Light meta. And when looking at the card by card, most of it is pretty standard, as all water decks that aren't 18 trainers have adjusted to playing not only Manaphy, but the Origin Form Palkia, as you want to go from Manaphy to Origin Form and then finish it up with your EX, whether it's Blastoise, Gyarados, or Palkia. Something that definitely jumped out at me was the choice of support cards, as they opted for a Giovanni and Irida. As to my knowledge, most water decks try to max out on the healing factor. And not only that, this player opted to play 0 Sabrina or Cyrus, which the lack of Cyrus maybe makes sense. Since you're not Palkia or Articuno, you can't spread damage to the backline and cheat out a Pokemon. But who am I to say? I'm not the one who finished second place. Props to this player. Honestly, this is not a list that I would have queued up and thought would have done well. Statistically, it didn't work out for most, but I have to give credit when credit is due. And this player played out of their minds and had great success with a deck that not most of us would have been able to. So although we're going to a new format next week, I'm interested to see how many people will stick to Gyarados in the flip of the format. And that leaves us with one final list to look at, and that list is Rampardos or Lucario, which in this format has been what Exeggutor was to Darkrai, as this list is meant to and efficiently counters Arceus and Dialga. And once this player was left in a field that was basically made up of just all Arceus, they capitalized and were able to knock out everybody in their way. As you can see from the matchup statistics, this deck realistically just has a 50% win rate across the entire board. But when it comes to playing against the most popular deck, it successfully wins over 60% of the matches. And when it comes to Rampardos, you're really committing to a straight line, as you hope to face as many of the most popular deck as possible, which is something that me as an Exeggutor player probably overlooked or underestimated how important it was to just prepare for the best deck. When it comes to the deck list, the Lucario Rampardos list has been pretty standard since the beginning of the format. The one noticeable difference from like the key or the standard or like the cookie cutter version is that they did opt to play one Hitmonchan over the second communication. Ultimately, this is another case of you got to give credit when credit's due. They were put in a position where they had the matchup advantage, but they had to close it out, as there was many fighting decks in Top Cut that didn't make it through. Congrats to the winner, and that closes out the metagame breakdown for the final week of the Triumphant Light meta. Ultimately, this tournament solidified what we already knew, that Dialga Arceus was the best deck, that Rampardos was the perfect counter. And although I personally did enjoy this format as a whole, I'm very excited to see all the changes coming in the new set of Shiny Revelry, which will make next week's breakdown quite interesting, as it'll be filled with the new strategies that we have no idea what the entire set is composed of. With that said, if y'all enjoyed this metagame breakdown and all things Pokemon Pocket, please consider liking and subscribing, and above all else, stay pro.